August 27, 1967. Hill 848, Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. Fog crawled like pale smoke over the ridgeline, clinging to the leaves, the stones, and the bodies of exhausted Marines who had not known silence in days. The air was thick enough to taste, a blend of wet soil, cordite ghosts, and the metallic scent that lingered after too many nights under fire. And crouched at the very edge of the ridge, where the jungle dropped off into a valley no man had crossed alive that week, Corporal Darius King knelt alone beside his rifle. He looked younger than 19. Slim face, steady shoulders, eyes that never darted or hesitated. The Marines around him had learned to read storms, mines, tripwires, and ambushes. But no one had ever learned to read him. He kept to himself, spoke rarely, and listened often. They said his hearing was sharper than the point men. They said he could smell an ambush before it happened. They said that when he fired, he never missed. But what they said the most, whispered in tents, muttered over ration tins, traded like folklore, was that Darius King was not normal, not blessed, not cursed, just different. And on that morning above Hill 848, as the sun struggled to push red light through the thick mist, even his spotter sensed something heavier in the air, something not quite right, something he couldn't name. King had stripped his M14 down to bare metal. No sling, no stock cushions, no magazines stacked around him. Just a weapon broken into the pieces that mattered, the gas cylinder, the bands, a barrel, the receiver, all laid out on a poncho liner like a surgeon preparing for an operation he alone understood. If you love stories like this, real courage, real history, then don't just watch, become part of it. Subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. And beside those pieces, a small bent piece of wire, thin as a matchstick, silver gray from use, no longer than a finger. No one knew where he got it. The Marines had theories, all of them wrong. Some swore the wire came from a ration crate. Others insisted it was part of an old radio set he scavenged weeks earlier. A few joked he stole it from a Claymore detonator. But none of them understood why he guarded it, cleaned it, carried it, and checked it every time he sat down to rest. They saw only wire. He treated it like a compass, or a key, or a secret only he had earned the right to touch. Below the ridge, the valley lay motionless now, but it had not been quiet for days. One sniper, hidden somewhere out there, had pinned down an entire battalion. A single rifle, a single man, a single set of hands steady enough to place round after round within inches of Marines who dared to lift their heads. His weapon was new, powerful, unfamiliar. The SVD Dragunov, a rifle with reach the Marines could not match. For 3 days, that single enemy had turned movement into death. 3 squads trapped, convoys stalled, evacuation birds refusing to land. Every attempt at advance chewed apart before it began. Command never said it outright, but the silence between their clipped radio transmissions told the truth. One sniper had stopped an entire Marine company, not a battalion of fighters, not a fortified enemy line, just one man and one rifle that hit before Marines could even return fire. Morale dipped, tension sharpened. Even the bravest men felt the slow creep of uncertainty, the kind that grows when you cannot see your enemy, cannot predict his timing, cannot outrange his fire. But King watched the valley differently. He was never convinced the Marines were truly outmatched. He had spent nights on patrol, crawling through mud, sliding against wet roots, dodging insects that stung without mercy. He had inspected shell impacts, measured odd angles in the dirt, noted shifts in rifle grouping, and bit by bit, he formed a conclusion most men would never dare speak aloud. The M14 did not need a better shooter. It needed a better alignment. Other Marines saw problems. King saw patterns. The M14s rounds weren't just landing short. They were drifting left. They were widening with distance. They were unstable in the wind. They were unpredictable after rainfall. To most, it looked like exhaustion or fear or simply bad luck. But King knew rifles like farmers know soil, intimately, instinctively, completely. Something was choking weapon. And as he sat on the ridge that morning, the wire beside him was not a tool of maintenance, not a weapon, not a charm. It was a revelation waiting to be proven. Behind him, the Marines shifted, whispered, scratched at bug bites, and tried to pretend they weren't listening to the strange quiet surrounding him. Because even without looking up, they could feel it. The moment before something important happens always feels different from the moments before it doesn't. Down in the valley, the unseen enemy remained silent, but the Marines could not trust silence anymore. Silence meant preparation. Silence meant patience. Silence meant the next shot would come when they least expected it. King breathed steadily, calmly, as if the air didn't cling to him like steam. He moved each piece of the rifle with deliberate precision, checking alignment points no one else bothered with. Distances measured not in numbers but in pressure, tension, and feel. He slid the wire into place between the gas cylinder and the front band, watching how it pressed, how it leaned, how it resisted. The rifle was misaligned. Every single one of them was. Not by much, but by enough. Enough to cost lives. Enough to give the Dragunov its advantage. Enough to paralyze an entire company. The thought didn't anger him. It clarified him. He tested again. Same result. He tested a third time. Again, somewhere behind him, the jungle rustled softly, a branch moving against another. Nothing more, but in a valley ruled by a ghost sniper, every sound felt like a warning. Still he kept working. His hands moved as if he had done this his whole life, because in a way he had. Back home in rural South Carolina, he spent nights in a workshop that smelled of engine oil and dust, watching his father tune old farm equipment. His father used to say the difference between a failing engine and a perfect one wasn't force. It was feel. Find the drift. Correct the pressure. Guide the machine back to balance. King felt the same truth here. The M14 wasn't hopeless. It was simply neglected. And the wire was the one thing that could reveal what eyes missed. He set the pieces aside, checked the alignment one more time, then slowly lifted his gaze toward the misted valley. He could feel it before he saw it. The faint tremor in the air, the vibration that meant the enemy rifleman was still out there, still waiting, still watching. But he also felt something else. Confidence, clarity, the steady rise of certainty in his chest. The sniper was not invincible. The Dragunov was not superior. The valley was not lost. A simple piece of wire, worth less than a cup of coffee, had just proven that the Marines had never been outranged. They had simply been misaligned. And as the fog thinned, revealing patches of sunlight on distant rocks, King began reassembling the rifle with slow, careful intention. The Marines behind him didn't understand yet, but they would. Soon, very soon, because for the first time in days, the valley felt like a battlefield with a chance, not a death trap. Before the next turn of this story, before the first shot of the morning breaks the silence, the narrator offers a gentle reminder. If you love uncovering forgotten battlefield legends like this, take a moment to share this video, like it, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support brings these stories back to life. King slid the wire into his pocket, the metal warm now from his hands. He inspected the horizon with a patience that felt older than his age. Below the valley waited a breathing, living terrain of danger and opportunity. But on that morning, it felt just slightly less controlled by fear, slightly more open to possibility. He tightened the sling, seated the magazine, checked pressure points once more. Then he lowered himself into the dirt. Ready, quiet, steady. The valley did not know it yet. The Marines behind him did not know it yet. Even King himself could not yet see the full shape of what was coming. But this was the moment the tide began to turn, because the next shot fired in that valley would not come from the enemy, and it would not be answered the way it had been before. The wire had changed everything, and dawn was about to prove it. The first light of morning crept slowly across Hill 848, stretching long shadows over the exhausted Marines who had spent too many nights pressed into the mud, waiting for a shot they could neither see nor outrange. The valley looked deceptively calm from above, the haze settling gently into its folds, patches of sunlight illuminating clusters of bamboo and shattered stone. But beneath the calm hovered the familiar chill of danger, the knowledge that somewhere out there, unseen and patient, rested the man whose single rifle had stalled the battalion. The Marines felt it before they admitted it. The enemy sniper had become a presence, a force, a ghost they could not escape. Every hour he remained silent was another hour of tension tightening around their throats. No one knew when he would fire again. No one knew how he kept moving unseen. No one knew how he measured distance so cleanly. Every Marine had a theory. None had answers. And silence in war was its own brand of cruelty. But on this morning, the quiet inside Darius King was different. Where others stiffened under the weight of expectation, he seemed to settle deeper into the earth, as if grounding himself for something long overdue. He had tested the M14's alignment 3 times. He had inspected its tension points. He had felt the flaw that had cost so many men their confidence. And now, with the wire tucked safely away, he understood the strange weight that had been in the valley for days. Not an unbeatable enemy, but an untuned symphony waiting for the right hands. King's calm did not spread to the Marines behind him, but it steadied the air around him. Even before he lifted the rifle, even before he scanned the ridgeline below, something had already shifted. The invisible balance of the battlefield had tilted. Not much, but enough. He eased forward on his elbows, lowering his body until he was nearly part of the ground. The mud chilled his skin. Humidity clung to every inch of fabric, and insects crawled along the grass, each carrying their own noise. But nothing distracted him. Not the heat, not the silence, not the possibility of death waiting on the next ridge. His world narrowed to the distance, the wind, the alignment he had restored, and the knowledge that the Dragunov shooter had no idea the advantage was gone. In the valley, the morning fog lifted slowly, revealing fragments of terrain the Marines had been unable to observe clearly for days. King saw faint impressions where boots had crushed grass, saw stones shifted unnaturally, saw where a branch had been bent downward recently. Small signs, subtle indicators, clues that only someone trained to live between shadows and logic could decipher. The enemy sniper had been moving. He was not static. He was not careless. He was calculating, choosing angles, shifting with the fog, predicting where Marines would think to hide. That precision had kept 3 squads pinned. And yet, what King sensed most in those subtle trails was not superiority. It was habit, method, pattern. The kind of pattern that betrayed a human touch, not invincible talent. Patterns could be read. Patterns could be predicted. Patterns could be broken. He let his breathing slow, syncing with the rhythm of the landscape. He watched how the light touched certain spots first. He charted distances mentally. He counted seconds between wind shifts. Every detail mattered. Every movement had meaning. Even silence revealed more than noise if one knew how to listen. And King listened deeply. Behind him, Marines adjusted their gear, unaware of the calculations unfolding in King's mind. The battalion had convinced itself the SVD had ended the possibility of maneuver. But King had already proven otherwise. The rifle he had reassembled was no longer weakened by humidity or misalignment. It was ready, sharper, more accurate, and balanced with the precision only someone who understood weapons by instinct could accomplish. Down below, sunlight glinted faintly on something metallic far in the east ridge. Nearly imperceptible, but enough. King marked it mentally. A potential hide, a sheen that shouldn't exist naturally. Not yet a target, not yet a threat, a possibility. He scanned further south. Old rocks, brush thickets, broken logs, nothing suspicious. Then further west, where the valley curved sharply before disappearing behind a slope. There, he noted a break in the grass, narrow and clean. Something dragged, something shifted, something placed. A possible firing lane carved days earlier. He shifted back to the east ridge. That faint glint still lingered in his periphery. His instincts leaned toward it. But instinct was not enough. Patterns were only part of the equation. Timing mattered more. Time had been the enemy for days. Now it became his ally. He waited, not Seco, NDS, minutes. The Marines behind him remained restless, unable to grasp why King was motionless while the valley still belonged to the enemy rifle. But King's stillness was not indecision. It was preparation. Every second he remained silent was a second the enemy sniper believed he remained dominant. A false confidence built slowly, predictably, a confidence that would be broken the moment dawn stretched fully across the ridge. King shifted his weight slightly, barely enough to disturb a single blade of grass. He positioned the rifle, resting it smoothly against the earth. The M14 felt different now. Responsive, steady, tuned. Humidity no longer owned it. Misalignment no longer dictated its breath. He watched the valley like a hawk watches a field mouse, patiently, purposefully, without blinking. The faint glint on the east ridge flickered again. A change in angle, a small adjustment, a sign of life, a sign of presence. King exhaled slowly. The enemy sniper was preparing for another shot. The Marines behind King tensed in invisible unison. Though they still didn't know what he saw, they sensed it. The air thickened. The wind paused. Even the insects seemed to hush for a moment. Then, as if on cue, a single crack of gunfire split the valley. The Dragunov had spoken again. Dust kicked up inches from a Marine crouched far below. Another near miss. Another reminder that the enemy held the advantage. Another shot intended not to kill, but to demoralize. But this time, there was no fear in King. No hesitation. No doubt. For the first time since the standoff began, the sniper below had fired a shot out of timing, out of rhythm, out of expectation. And King understood instantly what that meant. The enemy had grown impatient. Impatience leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to openings. Openings lead to endings. King steadied the rifle. The world around him faded into a simple equation. Distance, velocity, drop, wind, alignment. He checked his breathing, counted the seconds after the shot, calculated the time it would take the Dragunov shooter to observe his impact point. And then, with the same calm he had held since dawn, King fired once. The echo rolled across the valley like a wave. Every Marine froze. Every bird scattered. Every insect fell silent again. One shot. Only one. King didn't fire again. He didn't need to. The balance of the battlefield shifted instantly, not because someone had been hit, but because silence followed. And that silence felt different than the silence before it. The Marines waited for the Dragunov's reply, waited for retaliation, waited for the ghost in the valley to show itself. Seconds stretched longer, then longer still, then into a full minute. Nothing, not a breath, not a glint, not a second shot. The valley silence was no longer a threat. It had become a question, and questions in war weighed more than bullets. King slowly rose onto his elbows, not triumphant, not relieved, simply aware. Something had changed, something no Marine could yet articulate, something subtle and enormous all at once. The silence was no longer the enemy's. It belonged to him, but answers still lay ahead, hidden behind the ridges, the brush, and the abandoned paths the sniper had walked for days. King knew firing one shot was not the end. It was the beginning of uncovering the truth the valley had been hiding since the first round was fired. The battalion prepared to move. The valley prepared to reveal. And King prepared to see what the shot had unsettled. The next steps would not just expose an enemy position. They would rewrite the story the Marines believed they had been living. The descent into the valley began with a stillness the Marines had not felt in days. The thick morning fog parted slowly as they moved, revealing faint trails cut through the grass, the kind left behind by someone who understood concealment better than most soldiers ever would. Even before they reached the halfway point, they sensed what Darius King already understood deep within himself. The valley no longer belonged to the Dragunov. Its rhythm had shifted. Its silence had changed shape. Something had ended. Something else was beginning. The Marines advanced in disciplined formation, stepping carefully between patches of shattered stone and clusters of bamboo. The earth still held the memory of recent movement, but not the kind that suggested a retreat. It suggested transition, a shift from one hidden position to another, each chosen with precision. The man who fired the Dragunov was no ordinary marksman. He had been deliberate. He had been patient. And until this morning, he had been confident. Now his confidence had fractured. The valley's terrain began to reveal its secrets the deeper the Marines moved. King led the slow, deliberate descent, moving with the same quiet authority he had held when he first knelt on the ridge. The signs were small, a footprint half covered in dew, an indentation in the soil, a narrow gap through dense brush. But to King, they formed a trail as clear as a set of coordinates. The battalion's medic noticed the tension in the air before anyone else did. The feeling that something waited ahead. Not danger exactly, but truth. The kind of truth that reshapes understanding, not just tactics. A truth that explains why one Dragunov had been able to do the work of a full squad and why that silence after King's single shot felt heavier than any gunfire. The path wound around a jagged cluster of rocks, then dipped sharply beneath an overhang. There, tucked into the side of the hill, was a first hide site, small, compressed, intelligently reinforced with natural cover. It bore no signs of struggle, no signs of panic, no cartridge casings scattered wildly. It was neat, organized, methodical. But what drew every Marine's breath short was the presence of a rifle resting against a stone. It wasn't warm. It wasn't positioned for immediate use. It had been left there intentionally. The Dragunov? No. This rifle was different, older, worn at the grip, with weathered wood that suggested years of field use. A weapon maintained with care, not urgency. A weapon of someone who hunted trails long before this valley. Its barrel was cold, but its presence told a story. This valley had hosted more than one sniper. The Marines spread out, scanning the surrounding terrain cautiously. King studied the prints in the dirt. They didn't all move in the same direction. Some led east, others north. The pattern felt cooperative, not chaotic. The kind of movement that happens when two highly trained shooters work in quiet synchrony. But now, one of them had left his rifle behind. Why? King moved toward the prints leading upward. The clearer ones, the ones made more recently. They traced a path toward a second hide site, higher up and better concealed. As the Marines followed, the air thickened with the tension of discovery. The second hide site looked fresher. The footing was more disturbed, the soil slightly warmer where weight had shifted recently. And leaning against the stone wall, half hidden by foliage, lay the Dragunov. This rifle was warm. King approached it, examining the details. The weapon had been fired shortly before dawn. Its owner had departed quickly, but not in panic. In decision. A calculated departure, with purpose behind every step. Yet there was something else, something subtle, something that made King pause longer than anyone expected. The Dragunov had been sighted differently than typical enemy rifles, adjusted with a precision rarely seen. The type of adjustments made by those trained beyond standard marksman doctrine. The bipod impressions were angled sharply downward, overcompensation to counteract a rifle known to shift at long distances. The hide site reinforced with earth and cloth in ways not typical for the region. This was no ordinary sniper. It was someone trained to observe, to calculate, to adapt quickly. And yet they had left, not in fear, but in silence. The Marines scanned the ground for signs of blood or hurried movement, but found none. Whoever had occupied these hides had walked away as though they understood their role in the valley had come to its natural conclusion. King lifted a shell casing near the Dragunov's firing position. It was smoothed at the edges, polished by repeated handling, not something crude or rushed. A habit of a professional, a pattern of someone who respected their weapon deeply. As he examined it, the faintest breeze swept through the hide site, carrying the last traces of moisture clinging to the rock. That breeze seemed to whisper a truth the Marines would debate for decades. This shooter had not been killed, not wounded, not chased away. They simply vanished. Why they didn't fire at the Marines as they approached remained a mystery. Why they left two rifles, one cold, one warm, remained unanswered. Why they had walked away without finishing what they started, no Marine could say. Rumors would form. Theories would spread. Speculation would grow until the story took on a life of its own. Some believed the second shooter was a trainer evaluating the Dragunov sniper. Others thought he had been ordered to withdraw once the M14 regained its advantage. Others whispered he was something else entirely, a shadow from a foreign unit, an advisor, a ghost from another conflict whose presence was never meant to be documented. But nothing was ever proven. Nothing was confirmed. And history, as it often does, left the truth buried beneath the weight of speculation. What mattered most to the Marines on that day was that the valley was free. The battalion regained mobility within hours. Evacuation helicopters returned, finally able to land without taking fire. Medical teams moved through safe corridors that had been death traps only a day before. Convoys resumed. Communications steadied. The battalion's formation tightened back into rhythm. And as each M14 was inspected using the wire method King had discovered, the truth became unmistakable. The flaw had been there the entire time. A small misalignment, a minor drift, something overlooked in training manuals, ignored by armorers, hidden by humidity. A weakness exposed only because King understood the language of machines the way some men understand maps or storms. He had fixed it in seconds, and in doing so had saved more than 2,000 Marines whose fate had been narrowing by the hour. But the Marines never forgot the mystery of the second shooter. Some claimed they saw a figure on the distant ridge at dusk, moving with the grace of someone who had lived too long in the shadows. Others swore they heard a single faint metallic click echo through the valley days later, as if someone was checking a rifle far beyond the Marines' reach. The official report never mentioned a second shooter. The record remained clean. The narrative remained singular. One enemy sniper, one valley, one man who restored the balance. But those who walked through that valley, those who touched a cold rifle left behind, who traced the prints splitting in different directions, who felt the peculiar weight of two hide sights instead of one, they remembered more. They understood something deeper had unfolded in those shadows, something that would never be answered. Darius King never spoke publicly about what he found that day. He never explained the footprints, never elaborated on the cold rifle, never identified the second shooter. The wire he carried remained with him until the end of his service. A reminder of the morning he realigned more than a weapon. He realigned a battalion's fate. His discovery faded quietly into history, mentioned only in fragments, remembered only by those whose lives were preserved because one Marine refused to accept defeat as final. He walked away from Hill 848 without the medals that might have reflected the magnitude of his actions, but with the silent knowledge that sometimes the smallest ideas, the smallest pieces of metal, could change the outcome of war. The valley never revealed all its secrets, and perhaps it never will. But the shot King fired that morning echoed long after the fog cleared. It echoed through the battalion he saved, through the stories retold by veterans who remembered the fear of that valley, through the unanswered questions left behind on those cold stones, through the generations who still debate the identity of the sniper who walked away silently. History remembers generals. History remembers battles. But sometimes history shifts because one quiet man understood that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it kneels in the dirt with a bent piece of wire and refuses to accept the limits placed before him. And sometimes it saves thousands. Before this story closes, if you love these forgotten battlefield legends, please share this video, like it, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. And comment where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps them reach others who love Hist, or as much as you do.